Once upon a time, there lived a young family in the northeast of the continent, not far from the canal. The young father lived with his young wife and young children in a small one-industry town. The industry was mining. The town sat atop the mine. The family was experiencing some financial difficulties, so they took Autumn, the sweetest and most clever of their children, down to the mining corporation and signed her up to a piecework contract. The mine liked having the small children as workers. The passages were very small. A grown adult would get stuck at every turn in the tunnels, and for many of the lateral shafts wouldn't fit at all. And there were many tunnels forming a giant web below the town. It was hard work, but Autumn worked fast, and after not too many years, and despite her size, was carrying more of the precious ore back to the conveyors than even most of the older children. And she never got lost in the labyrinth. There were small ventilation shafts that ran from the surface hundreds of feet down into the mine, and the sunlight would brighten one edge or another of the ventilation shafts, and Autumn would know whether the tunnel ran north, east, south, or west, and what time of day it was, and somehow even the depth of the ground above her. And for years more she labored under the ground and never once complained. Then late in the summer, one day a terrible windstorm started to blow. The storm was fierce. The wind screamed, and anything small or loosely attached flew. It was hardly even noticed down in the mine, though. There was just a faint moaning sound coming down the ventilation shafts. On the surface was a different matter. Near and far it was taking its toll. A merchant with his riders and caravan of burdened camels, hundreds of miles to the north, was in a sandstorm, the likes of which he had never seen in all his years of traversing the Silk Road. His camels were loaded with fine silk fabrics and a few cell phones from China. His business was to move them west and then return carrying colorful dyestuffs and some treasury bonds back to Asia. But now the swirling sand created whiteout-like conditions. He, his men, and his camels were lost. Some days they just walked in large circles, crossing their earlier tracks. Sometimes the loops moved east, or sometimes a little west, but the new ones always seemed to move somewhat more south. So eventually, at great length, the caravan, with the exhausted men, just as the wind started to abate, came to a small town in the northeast corner of the continent. The mining town was exhausted in a way, too. Not the ore, there was still plenty of that. But the financial managers of the mining corporation had placed some large hedging positions in the commodities markets. So despite the mine having its highest output and most profitable year ever, the corporation was in trouble. Management doesn't always make the best decisions when under such stress. And so when the merchant of the Silk Road offered to buy out Autumn's contract for a bag of radishes, despite the fact that Autumn, now in her prime, was their most productive employee, the mining corporation agreed to the trade. It was a medium-sized bag of very fresh radishes. So Autumn left the town she grew up in that way, walking slowly alongside the line of camels, some burdened with loads of tightly wrapped fine silk fabric, some burdened with men. The wind was still blowing and the visibility still limited, but she could easily see where the sun lay in its path and so the way north. It surprised her that even when she pointed out the direction of the sun, many of the men would have chosen the path directly opposite their destination. So they moved along this way for weeks, heading slowly north. The merchant was happy, though, as he watched Autumn unerringly guide the caravan back onto the Silk Road. He didn't always know which way to go, but he always knew a good deal. He thought this thought many times, and it made him happy. Not long after they regained the Silk Road and turned west, they had to make an unexpected stop for the night. One of the camels was pregnant, and it was her time to deliver. It was a cool, clear night, and the winds had finally stopped. There was a thin crescent of a moon. It was a beautiful night, unless you were a camel in labor. The baby was not coming out. Something was wrong. The men really weren't paying any attention, but the camels somehow knew something was amiss. They didn't talk about it. Camels don't talk, but they are social animals and communicate in their own ways. And concerned for her and milling about her, they displayed a lot of agitation. The night wore on. The men were asleep and the young female camel was getting weaker. The camels still walked back and forth by her, but they had no idea what to do. At this point in the labor, they could have seen the problem, but camels don't understand such things. But Autumn, still awake, thinking about the elevation they needed to gain to cross the mountain pass tomorrow, looked over and saw the problem, and with her hands could fix it. She moved into the crowd of camels, the camels by now pressing close to the one in labor, and reached in to turn the baby camel in the birth canal. It took another half hour or so, but finally the baby was free and entered the world without further incident. As the baby struggled to its feet, all the camels got very excited and started to move around the baby and make a sound that could be described as a cheer. A very strange cheer. The camels were happy. They may not have understood the intricacies of birth, but they were very excited to see the baby standing up. Some of the men noticed the commotion, and seeing the camels swaying about pressed together around the mother and baby with Autumn in the middle of it, and got concerned, and not just because they knew they needed a guide to lead them through the difficult mountain pass the following day, and didn't want their guide crushed, but were really concerned for Autumn's safety, as many of them had gotten genuinely attached to her, leading them through the difficult terrain, working tirelessly, and never complaining. And so when several of them rushed into the throng of animals and pulled Autumn out, they no doubt felt very pleased with themselves for saving her. The camels saw it a little differently. It didn't bother them that she was back with the people. That made sense to them. But her assistance with the delivery of the baby made a big impact on them. She became more than just their bossy guide telling them to go on this path or that path. That had annoyed them at times, especially when they were sure they knew the better way, though there had been enough disagreements wherein they had begrudgingly come to realize that Autumn usually knew the better way. Now they really respected her, and it reinforced something else. The camels had always known that Autumn walked alongside them, didn't ride them, but they hadn't paid too much attention to that. It wouldn't have made much difference to them, but now the camels understood the significance and saw the connection and camaraderie in it. Autumn guided the caravans year in and year out, from the European coast through the mountain passes, across the plains of Mongolia and deep into China. The trade grew, the number of camels grew, and the number of men tending the caravan shrank. The merchant found he didn't need so many men, and then he found that even with the now great number of camels, he really didn't need any men, or even himself. He found he could stay at home. He would sit there and think of all the great deals he was making, just sitting there, and it made him happy. That's how it came to be, in the middle of the plains of the Gobi Desert in Mongolia, as the great caravan moved slowly towards the west. The camels walked steadily, burdened with the brightly colored silks and very many cell phones. The caravan stretched from east to west, horizon to horizon, and the camels shoulder to shoulder covered the earth as wide north to south as they did east to west. You could be standing on a very high hill and see nothing but the backs of camels, and in the middle of them was one young woman walking. And the camels never squabbled, and they walked very close to Autumn, but never got in her way. They all loved her. And no one dared to attack the caravan, even in the most remote and uncivilized parts of the Silk Road, as no one knew what an army of camels could do, but no one wanted to be the first to find out. So into the sunset, toward the west, the ocean of camels moved, their humps like small waves on a vast sea, the warm sunshine lighting the brilliant fabric loads. Autumn was happy. Aimee lived on another continent, in a very different place, near the continent's coast. Aimee loved her parents, and her parents loved her. They lived together on a ranch raising horses. It could have been idyllic if they had lived a few hundred miles to the north where the blue grass grew. The bluegrass was wonderful fodder for horses of all types. The ranchers up north would turn their horses loose in pasture. The animals would graze contentedly all day, every day. And when the rains came, it just made the bluegrass a little greener and taller and sweeter. The horses would graze, and the young folk would ride them around a track, competing with each other. And the rest of their days would be spent betting or drinking or just laying in the grass doing nothing in particular. There was no bluegrass where Aimee lived. Pretty much no grass at all. Mostly dirt or sand, depending on how close to the beach you were. No edible fodder. The few plants that grew were mostly McDonald's thistle and nugget wort and spiny bracken. If the horses were allowed to just freely forage for themselves, grazers that they are, they probably would have died eating the poisonous plants or starved eating the others. And they would have. Most horses are very stupid animals. It was an impossible situation except for the barrier islands just off the coast. The islands were not much more than sandbars, and depending on where exactly you measured, they were 10 to 15 miles off the coast. The centers of the islands did have marshy, boggy areas, though. These sandy swamps were uninhabited by man or beast, but they did contain some very nutritious vegetation, a lot of good forage. Horses are naturally very strong swimmers, but with their total lack of foresight, would of course starve right on the beach. So Aimee, as she had done so many times in the past, opened the corral and led the horses down to the beach. There she pushed a small wooden sabot down the sand to the water, then wading out led the little sailboat through the low breaking waves. Then the tricky part. She had to climb into the little boat without tipping it over, tighten the main sheet line so the sail would begin to pull, and while holding the tiller steady, use her other hand on a long lead line to coax the first horse into the sea. Once she got past the breakers and the other horses were following the first, it got much easier. The horses swam well, their large bodies giving them a lot of buoyancy, though still their heads were not that much above the waves. They could not see where they were going very well and often got off course. Then Aimee would have to turn the boat with the small single sail onto a broad reach and skip sideways over the waves to round up the wayward animal. Though not the easiest thing to do, play sheepdog with a sailboat, especially if the waves were at all high or she had to tack through the wind to collect the horses, she became adept at it. Even if the conditions were perfect and all went well, it was still a very long day to move the horses offshore, and she usually only carried a small amount of fresh water with her and an apple and a small piece of cheese. She would leave the horses on the island for a few days and then sail back to retrieve them, or sometimes she would stay with them. They couldn't be left alone for long, as there was little fresh water on the islands. As the years passed, the horses increased in number. There were many foals being born every spring. Some died in childbirth, but most were healthy, no surprises. But this year was different. A very strange baby horse was born. There was nothing strange about its mother, a very average horse, but the foal was different. So different no one thought it would live out its first week. It had an additional set of legs, and they didn't come from the shoulder or hip, but more high on the back, between the shoulder and spine. There were extra joints and musculature, noticeably more so on the foal's right side. It was a very strange animal, though strangely it seemed healthy and maybe even a little stronger than the average foal. Despite its somewhat unsymmetrical build, the strange animal thrived. It grew quickly and was doing well in all ways except swimming. The horse was thin, though much more muscular than the others. This made swimming in the water very difficult. Even the extra buoyancy of the salt water was not barely enough to keep its head out of the waves. Aimee knew that as it grew, the situation would only get worse. Aimee worked very long days, usually 14 to 16 hours, tending the horses at land and sea, and in addition doing all her other chores around the ranch. Sometimes, if the wind was steady behind her and the sea would flat, she would tie off the tiller and curl up in the bottom of the boat so as to get a couple hours of much-needed sleep. But any week where she found some extra time, she would go off to town to the internet cafe there. She never drank coffee, but she was almost addicted to the aroma. She also liked to watch old Jacques Cousteau specials from the 1960s that were streamed online. And one day, looking at the divers skimming across the waves in their Zodiac inflatable boat, Aimee got an idea. She went to the large truck stop in town and got 4 large truck tire inner tubes. She collected a few other materials and headed home determined to make an inflatable boat for her strange little horse. She sat at the table with several sheets of paper in front of her and for hours measured and sketched designs that would allow the horse to walk across the beach and then support it in the water. It was a much more difficult project than she first anticipated. What she thought would take a couple of days took weeks. When the design was finalized, she started building the craft. Working at night by kerosene lantern, she carefully cut the panels of inner tube rubber to her drawings, then had to precisely overlap and glue and stitch the seams. This was extremely tedious, as even one pinhole left without an overlap and glue covering it would be disastrous. But she kept working and working night after night, and finally it was done. She laid the strange boat, roughly the shape of a donut, on the beach. She led the horse onto it and tightened down the straps over the horse's back that would support the device when the horse was not in the water. She had purposely made the donut larger than the horse's body so it would still fit as he grew larger. With the flotation adjusted, he soon became comfortable and understood it was for his benefit. He was much smarter than the average horse. On some level, he knew he was connected with the legendary winged horses of the past, maybe even the mythological flying horse Pegasus. He would not bring this up with the other horses, as his disability would stand out that much more compared with his heroic ancestors. So he just made the best of it and tried to look and act as normal as possible. She led him out through the low surf, and it lifted him, bringing his head and neck well above the waves. Autumn had been crossing the continent east to west and west to east so many times for so long now that sometimes it seemed like a dream. Time seemed to stand still as nothing new happened. But this year would be different. Autumn was heading east with her great gathering of camels. In the last few years, as the caravan passed through a country, feral camels would join like children following a parade. So many did this that the number of camels, which had been unimaginably large a year or two past, had grown many times over. Now each camel carried barely 100 pounds of color dye stuff merchandise and treasury bonds, and yet the total quantity of the trade was the largest it had ever been. But something was wrong, too. The camels were uneasy, a little like they were so many years ago when Autumn had to help with a difficult birth. Autumn had almost forgotten the animals being agitated like that. It so rarely happened. But now the memory came back to her, and she was uneasy about it, too. They were heading eastward high in the Himalayas, where even the lowest passes had air so thin at night that even Autumn had to slow down. And then they came upon a Tibetan village. Every time Autumn had passed through a village in this area, the locals had come smiling out to greet her. Especially the children would run up to her and mob her with their arms around her, hanging on. But the whole atmosphere, what there was of it, was somber now. The other thing Autumn noticed was a lack of the colorful prayer flags and ribbons that usually filled the skies around these villages. The prayer wheels were there, but no one was spinning them. Finally, some of the older monks in their faded saffron robes made their way through the camels and up to Autumn. The colorful flags and ribbons with their prayers written on them could not be made. The whole village was in a state of depression. They had no color dye, and the prayers tied to the colorful substrates were critical to their spiritual lives. They depended on it. Autumn, of course, had essentially unlimited supply of color dyes, but they were the property of the silk fabric producers, and she was expected to deliver the goods within the week. The monks knew this, but more importantly knew that the dyes were already the property of the silk manufacturers and could not rightfully ask for them. Then Autumn spoke and offered the monks all the dyes she was transporting. She thought she would figure out what to say to the silk fabric manufacturers later, but she knew she had to do this. The villagers were very happy, to say the least, and the children once again were particularly happy and formed a mob around Autumn whenever she walked. And then the color started appearing here and there, almost like flowers blooming in the thin, dry air, and soon the whole village was awash in color fluttering in the breeze. After 2 days, Autumn gathered her caravan and started to walk out of the village. She thanked the monks and led her camels out of the village. A day later, there was one more pass to climb. As Autumn led her camels to the top of the gap in the mountains, much to her surprise, she saw that every camel still carried its full load. In fact, it seemed she had added a couple of camels to her great herd, and every one carried a full load on its back. And she never miscounted. Aimee had sized her zodiac-like flotation device very well. Her strange little horse was now a strange fully grown horse, and all was well, except for the weather. There was another problem with being this far south. The ocean was warm, nice for horses to swim in, nice if you're getting splashed with it when you're sailing your little boat. But the warm water feeds energy to the storms, and sometimes the storms are very powerful and arrive with little notice. Usually Aimee would watch the waves and see them increase in height, and particularly she would look at the period. The big waves with the long period carry a lot of the storm's energy and can carry it great distances. Usually there were a couple of days of threatening waves before the low-pressure system arrived, but there was very little warning this time. Aimee was standing on the beach with her horses on the island when the storm waves and surge in the tide and dark sky appeared. Aimee had never seen anything like this before, and never had seen it come in this fast. But she knew she had to get her horses back on the mainland. They would be swept off the low-lying sand of the barrier island. So she pushed her little sabot down the beach to the water. The tide was very high, and the waves were already washing over the sand. Aimee managed to get out to the island to assemble her horses and get them into the water. They were making good time returning to the mainland, urged on by the waves behind them. Actually, Aimee's problem was slowing the boat down enough to stay with the swimming horses. So even though the storm arrived quickly with a heavy downpour of rain and the occasional lightning flash and thunder, Aimee was confident she and her charges would make it safely back to land and the high ground where the corral was located. It was strange, though. Her horse with the extra feathery limbs was lagging behind. He had been the strongest swimmer for a long time now, but he was in the back, and Aimee could tell something was wrong. It was very difficult and took all of Aimee's seamanship skill to turn the little boat back into the wind. The wind was now very high, and the waves had very steep square faces, but she managed to do it and make her way slowly back to the strange horse, who was now clearly in trouble. It seems the waves and winds had broken a large patch of kelp free, and it had tangled around the horse's legs and strapping of the inflatable flotation device. Aimee was leaning out of the boat and using her pocket knife to cut away the tangled kelp. But with a strong gust, the little boat was knocked down, leaving its mast and shredded sail trailing in the water. Aimee was holding onto the horse's neck with her arms, while her feet were still down against the floor of the flooded boat. In addition, the horse's larger right side wing-like limb was caught in the inflatable tube and straps, too, and was thrashing about. Aimee had to make a decision. So with a very quick series of cuts, more swordsmanship than surgery, Aimee managed to separate what was left of the kelp-tangled inflatable from the horse. As it drifted away with Aimee clinging to the horse's neck, a gust of wind that must have been hurricane force pushed a breaking wave over them. When they bobbed to the surface, another gust came, and it caught under the horse's massive wing. Aimee had never seen it stretched out. It was much larger than the horse's body, and for a moment she wondered how he could have kept it folded up out of sight. And then she wondered why she was thinking about things like that when clearly her life was in danger. Then, with such a suddenness that Aimee couldn't even register what was happening, much less the craziness of it, the horse shuddered, and before Aimee could fully get her other leg over the horse's back, she saw that both wings were extended. Even with the incredible size of the wings and the great force of the wind, it was surprising how quickly the horse and Aimee climbed into the sky. The storm was a very large storm. It covered the entire North Atlantic. It was fierce. It lasted for days. Somehow Aimee hung on. When they finally landed in the field, Aimee wasn't conscious, but somehow she was still hanging on. Her horse folded his wings and then knelt down. A very unusual thing for a horse to do, but not the most surprising thing this horse does. As he knelt down, Aimee's grip loosened, and she slid down his side onto the thickest, sweetest, greenest grass she had ever seen. They had landed in a very nice field that was tended by a very nice older couple. They let Aimee stay in their barn for a few days and even gave her some apples and cheese. Aimee gave all the apples to her wonderful horse. They were a long way from home. They didn't know exactly how far the great storm had carried them and had their doubts about being able to fly back. They really weren't sure about the whole flying thing at all. Aimee had noticed her horse's two different sized wings tended to carry them in large arcs, which she had to compensate for. Again, Aimee realized that she was thinking too much. She looked into her horse's big brown eyes and could see his intelligence and also determination. They didn't know exactly where, but they were going to go for it. In a smooth sweep, they soared into the sky, keeping the sun just over their right shoulders. Then they flew across the Irish Sea and England and the English Channel. They ended up in Belgium and found some very nice farmers with an even nicer barn who gave Aimee a blanket for her horse. She wanted to keep the whole flying thing quiet, and the blanket was very helpful in that regard. After some days mooching off the farmers, Aimee decided to go into town to see if any work was available. There was a small coffee shop there, and it had a help wanted sign in the window. Aimee knew a thing or two about coffee, even though she never drank it. Her time in the internet cafe and being a quick study allowed her to not only fix highly esoteric computer problems, but she could also make every coffee drink thought up by man. She went in to apply for the job and talked with the young woman behind the counter. It turned out the woman behind the counter knew a great deal about coffee also, having first learned about it leading a caravan of camels north through the Middle East to the Silk Road.